had never worked with REI before we worked with an REI. We had never presented to a client like Google before we presented to a client like Google, but we ended up winning Google. So for me, there's never like a it's too big or it's too much or it's too far away to not go after it. It is like that naivete and like that childlike optimism of like, no, we can do this. Like, other people have done it. Like, let's go for it. And as long as it's like in that space of like passion and I'm still learning, that's what brings me a lot of joy.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? I'm Britton Stepetic, and this is Low-Key Legends, the show where I sit down with creative legends to fish out nuggets of wisdom that you can take away on your creative journey. Today, I'm joined across the screen by Erwin Hines, an artist, designer, creative director, and the only person that I know who has been successful at selling apparel. He's the founder of Open Gym, a hospitality group that focuses on building sustainable ecosystems of change within communities through the power of space, food, and well-being. And also the founder of FUTURE is COLOR, which is Erwin's solo research studio focused on using design to create space for meaningful conversations of change. I know I have a million questions, and this is a conversation that we've had in the work for months, and we finally made it happen. So I'm excited, and let's dive in. Erwin, thank you so much for being here. I'm super jazzed up to talk, and I'm excited because we'll probably talk about jazz. We're going to talk about design, but then there's also a million things that I want to get into. And I was hoping to start in a little bit of an unconventional space. I wanted to start with, what does community mean specifically and personally to you? And when was the first moment that you realized that community was impactful and essential to us as humans?
Whoa, that's a really good question. I guess to me, community just means like a broad support system made up of diverse and disparate perspectives that help to challenge us and push us to grow as humans. That to me is like what true community means, right? I think a lot of people might say like a community is like this group, and sort of like separated and shared values and interests, which is true. But sometimes those shared values and interests can deeply entrench us in what divides us, as opposed to what really like unites us as a group of people. So that's been my perspective that has developed over time and really has been in development since I was a kid. So my parents, and this is like what made me realize community is such an important thing. When I was growing up, my parents owned a development company, and then that development company was specifically focused on creating affordable housing on the border of the inner city and the suburb, particularly for people of color. And then on top of like building the house, they would take me to work with them every weekend, which I didn't want to do as a kid. But what I saw in those actions is that they weren't just building the house; they were actually like checking up on the families, making sure the families had what they needed to actually properly take care of the home. And when you properly take care of a home, the value of that home increases over time, which then ultimately impacts how one might view themselves over time. So I begin to see the sort of like structure of how you can create meaningful change within communities through the acts of like community, if that makes sense, and through the things we build. So for me, that's also what got me into design in the first place. So with design, I first was like following the pathway of architecture engineering with the goal of being an urban planner or city planner. So for me, it was about, from the foundational point of getting into design, it was like, how do I use the things we make to create meaningful change within communities by building something that people can actually like see themselves in and transform how they see their own communities.
There's a couple of really key things in there. It was, for me, the fact that community has an aspect of growth and pushing you to be better, which is something that I never realized until meeting my wife, who pushed me in a lot of different ways. One, as a man; two, in my faith; three, just on like a personal and focusing not on being selfish, but more community focused, family focused, and expanding that outward. So that was huge for me in understanding what that word meant and that I could empathize that way. And then secondly, what I really loved was what you had said about designing space for this effective use of, oh gosh, I'm going to use the wrong words, but using space intentionally and for specific reasons. I thought that was beautiful.
Oh, yeah, that was great. That you hit it right on the head. And just one thing to like note on, even on that idea that communities are here and put into place so that we can all grow. I think some people also might hear them and say like, oh, if this person isn't serving me, they shouldn't be in my community. And like the whole thing is we don't understand, or we might not understand how things are actually serving us. And it might not necessarily feel the best in the moment, but everything is sort of put into place for the growth of our own humanity, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah. It sounds like your parents had an incredible impact, one on you, but also just the community of Cleveland, the outskirts, that residential area as well. Are there any other specific lessons that you learned or took away that helped to develop you as the man you are today and the businesses that you run currently?
I honestly think, and I like give all the credit to my family. Like I grew up in a very like tight knit family, but also very big. And I mean, growing up as a Black man in America, you're oftentimes shown things that might not necessarily ring true to your own experience about who you should be and who you are, right? Based on what media shows you. My parents did a very good job, and my family did a very good job of like rooting me in a sense of pride of who I am through education, books, knowledge of self was a very big thing in my family. And it wasn't like a overt, like, hey, we're going to give you knowledge of self. Like they weren't saying that. It was just like these subtle actions of just like providing me books that I could just read casually. So instead of like zoo books, I had like these books that were actually showing sort of like these dynamic figures within Black history in America, right? And so it wasn't just me learning about Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. It was learning about George Washington Carver and all of these other individuals who helped shape these aspects. So it allowed me to really see a more dynamic picture of who I am as a person. And then along with that, my family did a lot of volunteer work. So even if we had, it was really about how do we use what we have to make sure that we're uplifting everybody else as well. And that wasn't just my parents, but that like came down also from my grandparents. So it was like a shirt that I just made that was talking about the pursuit of generational wealth oftentimes lead to generational trauma, because you just pursue these sort of like material things and you use that as justification for why you're not around and why you're not present in the lives of the loved ones that you have. Whereas we really need to be pursuing generational joy, generational love. And that's the true generational wealth. And for me, that came from like many conversations with my grandfather, who was hyper present there with us, as was my grandma, as was my other side of my family, my grandpa and my grandpa on that side. So I feel like I just had a hyper present family. And then again, that hyper present family was also hyper present within community and showing up for community, whether it was like our house was always open to anybody. So if there was like a cousin who was having trouble in school, we would then like have them come live with us. And it wasn't just like my family and my immediate family doing that. It was like all my uncles would do that as well for some of our other cousins. So it was just like a true, again, that just showed me what community really is. It's this mutual support. It doesn't mean we always have to agree, but there was just this deep mutual support and care for each other's humanity. So again, like a lot of this, I didn't realize any of this until I started Future is Color. And then I did like a whole like look back at my life. And I'm like, why am I doing this? Why am I leaving the agency space to start a t-shirt brand, which I would have never, that was never a goal. And I was like, there has to be some steps that led to this. And then when I looked back, it was a lot having to do with what I saw within my family and how my family approached um, giving community service in general. And it wasn't a matter of like, we're doing this for any benefit for us. It was like, for me, it just seemed like this is just a natural part of life. Like you do this not for glory, not for any shine, not for anything like that. You just do this because that's just what you do. And that's just the natural part of living.
I have a quote from you here, and then I wanted to circle back to books as well. And maybe the feeling that kind of tension between leaving the agency as well as starting Future is Color. So there's a lot that we're going to get to, but I thought this quote did a good job of summarizing what you had just said. And this seems hyper relevant and true to you personally. Every project serves the people and the culture. This is a quote that I got from you from somewhere on the internet. You can't trust everything you read on the internet, but it was an article attributing you. And it seems like that is very true to everything that you're doing now, but even the work that you set out to do, thinking that you were going to go into architecture as well. How has this kind of mindset, well, I guess, formed with your parents and that influence, but how has it spread throughout all of your work, even in when you were working in the agency world in design?
Oh yeah, I think it deeply impacted how I approached all work when I was at Basic, right? So when I first got into design, I think there's always this sort of trajectory where I was just learning the skill set. And I was so passionate about just like typography and laying things out. It was like the most amazing thing because I had never learned it before. As soon as I had started to really learn it and then look at how I can apply it, that's where like it became a lot deeper for me. And I started to connect those things of like growing up in childhood and all of those things to sort of this like skill set of graphic design. And so at Basic, a lot of the work that I was like putting forward or putting out, for me, I would almost view myself as like this is what I said in my head when I was at Basic. I was like, oh, I feel more like a journalist where I'm doing like field research, trying to understand this group of people, trying to understand what's happening within society, understanding the tensions that are happening within society. And I'm using that as more of a research project for me to grow as a person. Like that's how I was using the work. And then sort of how I like articulated it was in some form of design, whether it was web or campaigns or sort of like in-store retail. For me, that sort of like research piece, the understanding piece was the thing that I got a lot of joy out of. But I think it's also because for me, it was more so about how am I using these sort of like methodologies or design to actually learn about something else outside of myself and then present that something else that was outside of myself back to the world in a meaningful fashion that can help change maybe a perception on a group of people. So for me, it was like the work. That's also why I have like artists in my sort of description. And I know people like to separate design and art, but for me, similar to art, where art is a reflection of current society back to itself so that society can now begin to see itself in a broader way or be challenged and actually like have conversation and dialogue that pushes society forward. For me, design just operates on a mass scale to do the same thing. So I can use design, advertising, marketing, websites. It's going to impact and touch more people than just this one piece of art that's hanging in a gallery. But what it can do is actually, again, create space for conversation, dialogue that creates opportunity for transformative change within society. I don't know if that answered the question. I feel like I went on I feel like I always go on like some other tangent.
Well, we went on like a beautiful arc and it'll touch to a lot of different things. But I mean, the idea of being like a researcher and journalist inside of this kind of using that as a lens for design, was that something that was encouraged, cultivated at Basic, or is that something that you brought to the team and it was incorporated as a skill set?
I think that's something that I brought to the team. That's how I always, like when I was in university, like that was my joy. Like again, after I learned sort of like the basics, grid, typography, colors, all of that stuff, for me, the biggest joy was again doing that research, understanding what's going on, and almost using designs as a lens to do research through, if that makes sense. Like, I didn't love education and school until I found design. Like, once I found design is when I actually fell in love with knowledge in a deeper, more intentional way. So even if I was reading when I was younger and getting all these books, I didn't love it. It just felt like it was part of what I was doing. Even in like high school, it's not like I loved school. I didn't love class. It was like, it felt more like something I have to do in order to do something else. Whereas once I like found design, it was like everything aligned, and I became super passionate about taking in as much knowledge as I can. Right. So like, that's why I'm saying, like, for me, design was a pathway that helped organize my mind to give more importance to the knowledge that we come across on a day-to-day basis.
Growing up in the Midwest, how did your perspective of the world change when you moved to San Diego in California? And I think tying it back to the research and the kind of journalist lens, did it open you up to new perspectives, new people, and opportunities to kind of dive in and learn more about humanity, culture, community as well?
When I was growing up, we traveled a lot, not internationally, but my parents were very intentional again about like, we'll go to Florida every year. We'll go to Arizona. We went to California because I have like family who lives out here. So we were always sort of like taking in, or I felt like I was always sort of observing and taking in other cultures and other things. That also created in my head that there was like so much out in that world that I wanted to explore, even though I was like situated in the Midwest. And I think just in general, growing up in the Midwest, there's so many beautiful aspects to the people, to how things move and how slow it is, and how you just have time to like understand yourself and understand who you are, as long as you're given sort of like that time and that space to do so. But then with that, it's like everything I saw in the media was like New York City, California. So I was almost able to develop these fictions in my head of what all of these other spaces were like, right? So I probably had like the most unrealistic idea of what New York City was like. No, we would go visit, but it's like, it's different to live there versus visit. And so my perspective of New York was like a tourist, like a preteen tourist perspective of this big city, also then based on Sex and the City. And just like other like movies around like Christmas time in the city, right? And then of like California, it was really this structure where my mind put together San Diego and the beaches of like San Diego, the sort of like urban texture of like SF, and then some of like the culture of LA. And I just thought that was all California. Like, I was like, anywhere you go in California is going to be just like that, like what I see in like Snoop Dogg's videos. But in doing that and developing those fictions, I feel like it created a lot of room again for imagination and for me to create a lot of the things that I create now are based on almost the fictions of what I thought those spaces would be like. And so like, even I'm gonna like jump forward, even like the jazz night, it's me referencing what I thought Andy Warhol and Basquiat would have been doing in New York during a particular period of time. And then like, obviously like all these other things like the Harlem Renaissance and all those things. But obviously these things didn't exist at the same time. And then how it exists in my head, it probably didn't exist like, but it allows me to create from that space of fiction. Again, I feel like I went on a tangent from the actual original question. Because I travel, and because my parents were intentional about like getting us out of the Midwest and getting us out of Cleveland a lot. Then when I actually, went to university, I went to school in Maryland my first year. Then I took a year off and then went to like live in New York and like couch surf on some friends' couches. That's when I actually learned about graphic design as a career field. I was like, oh wow, this is the thing I could do. Those logos and things and CD covers I was designing in Microsoft Art or Word were like, I can actually like really pursue that with some actual tools. Then I went to live back to school in Pittsburgh. And so for me, that openness and sort of this journalistic approach to life and this more observer approach to life allowed me to really understand just how much difference there is amongst people, but also how we're all just deeply connected. Like to me, that was like my big takeaway from living in all these different places, and not necessarily being a chameleon and fitting in necessarily, and not having to like put off who I am, which I did struggle with. Like when I first moved to California, I was like, oh, do I become a surfer? Is that what I do? Like, how do I like show up here? But again, it was like me sort of like understanding that there's so many diverse perspectives in this world, and that's a super beautiful thing. And we need to be able to understand, hear, listen, take that in, and allow that to feed our own individualized growth.
That for me is what I found beautiful about moving to New York. So grew up kind of Providence, Boston, kind of in the middle of those two cities. So I could go to either very easily, but Providence isn't as diverse. Boston is more medical, and you kind of only see like two groups represented, Irish or Italian.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the train line kind of divided different groups amongst the urban planning. But moving to Boston for school, got to see a unique perspective, but then especially moving to New York and realizing that there was pockets of everyone everywhere, a city of immigrants, and getting to experience culture through food, through art and music, and having that representation just like as a part of my everyday life, whether it just was walking down the street, seeing graffiti in multiple different languages and just soaking up like that perspective. It really did change me in how I think about art, how I think about music, how I think about music in the context of where that person is from and the stories that they're sharing. It was somehow very formative. And this is getting to a question of, when you were traveling from those individual cities, were there moments where you kind of noticed yourself changing along that journey through this observer mindset?
Oh yeah. Like I think each city has that. So even on the tags of all my clothes, it has all the area codes of the cities that were super transformative. And it just looks like a random serial number. But for me, it was like super important to say, like, these are the cities that impacted me. Cleveland, obviously, Pittsburgh, Maryland, New York. The first time I really noticed internal and sort of like this mental shift was when I was in New York, sitting in Washington Square Park. So now Washington Square Park is by far my favorite park in the world. Just maybe not in the world, but in New York, because it's like you see the world existing in this small space, all sort of like jammed together. You have people playing the piano. You have like people playing, like a full jazz band will be playing. You have the skaters. You have everything just happening in this like very, very small space. But when I was sitting there, that's when I was like, wow, the world is so big, so diverse, so broad. And how can I just, again, understand what you were just saying was like very true. How do I look at all of these different acts and understand the lineage of that act, or understand the lineage of this genre of music, understand the overarching deeper context of where things come from. So I feel like something about that part for me, it really unlocked that. And then going to like the Whitney, and then from the Whitney going to the Comedy Cellar, like those, it was something. And this was all like one day. And then after that day, I felt like, oh, I really understand sort of my place within sort of like not just the creative world, but it gave me a deeper understanding of where I sit and how I should sit within interactions with the world.
I'm sure that there was something I was going to ask, but I got caught up listening to the sultry sound of your voice. And when you moved to California and started working at Basic, did you start as just a standard graphic designer there? And what was your relationship as you kind of evolved within the agency, as well as the agency evolving and expanding and becoming, you know, what it is now up into the point where you had left?
When I first joined Basic, I did join as a designer. Funny story, I actually didn't know what Basic was. The agency that I had worked at prior to Basic, there was a pizza shop right across the street that was named Basic Pizza. And so I had left that agency, was doing freelance for a while for like Sony, and then also worked on like the Call of Duty app. So I was like, I'm doing well. And then I get an email saying like, hey, do you want to come be a designer at Basic? I'm like, absolutely not. Why would I want to do that? And in my head, I'm like, I'm thinking this is Basic Pizza, this like local restaurant trying to reach out to me. But then they explained like what Basic is. I looked at the portfolio and just saw the amazing work that they were doing and didn't even think that something like that could exist in San Diego. Went to meet with them. They ended up joining. I was one of the first 5 people at Basic. And so everybody was a designer. We only had one art director, and then Matt Falk, founder, CEO. And then we had Eric Rossell, who was the co-founder and also like creative director of the space. But even as a designer at Basic, you essentially had to act as your own CD, because each designer was almost focused on their own project and owning that project from presentation to deck creation to strategy. So you're really owning the full spectrum of these big branding projects. Like we branded a whole neighborhood in San Diego, like the first year I was at Basic. And it was like we had to do the research, the strategy, the naming of a neighborhood, the brand structure of the neighborhood. Like we had to do all of that. And then we also helped like, hey, what the next 15 years might look like from a structure standpoint in a build out, which then took me all the way back to like childhood with my parents. But so when I say I joined as a designer, the role and responsibility of everybody at this space at that time was like, you almost hold all hats. And then over time, over time, I grew to be creative director at Basic. And for me, Basic was really special, mainly because I never chased being a creative director at Basic. Just like I feel like I didn't really chase being a designer. I didn't chase coming to California. All of these things just sort of like happened, and like it was almost like more like divine alignment that got me into these spaces. But the growth at Basic really came from the fact that I was continuously taking on more and more responsibility, and I just felt deeply invested into not only the expansion of this agency, but also what we stood for and what they still stand for, which is believing that brands have the opportunity and the potential to be more human, right? And so for me, that was something that I really latched onto from my experiences from childhood, from like going to New York and really understanding, again, there's a deeper lineage behind every single piece of art and every single piece of artifact that has ever been created by any human. There's a deep story. And all of those stories make all of these artifacts very human. And then there's that sort of like tipping point, whether that artifact can have positive impact or negative impact on society. And so at Basic, I felt like we can actually have deeper positive impact by affecting change at these large organizations. And so like our first clients, when I first got there, we were, again, working with San Diego and helping to do branding for the city. But then we ended up getting REI and doing their digital experience and their retail experience. We worked with like HTC and did like their whole like in-store experience. So we were doing like a lot of different things. And there was like a 3-month, 4-month period where we were doing like all of the key art for like AAA titles, which were insane all-nighters to do like actual key art, which none of us had any clue how to do. But again, the joy at Basic was like, go in, you're going to work on a website. Next day, you're going to do an app. The next day, you're going to do like an actual logo and a whole brand system. Next day, you're going to do a big campaign for New Era with retail. The next day, you're going to do key art for Sony's top or AAA titles. So there was like a lot of diversity of experience that I was able to gain and pick up at Basic.
Are there any kind of like 4 key lessons that you learned from that experience? And I'm sure we'll touch on, again, the divine connection, as you had mentioned, kind of picking up on those signs of getting to California, getting to Basic, knowing when the right moment was to transition out of that, even though it probably was a hard decision. So back to this specific question, are there any really foundational lessons that you learned from your experience at Basic that you later took away and brought into this new phase of your creative career?
Oh yeah, everything. That's like a broad thing. I was literally just talking to another young designer about this the other day on a photo shoot, and I was like, everything that I am now as a designer and a creative director or somebody who can actually like activate brand space came from my time at Basic. Because I think Basic helped hone my skill set. And like I was saying, since we did so many different things from key art to brand architecture, brand strategy, as a designer or creative director, you're presenting to clients, you're building decks. We also started our own companies with Basic because we're like, what is a brand? A brand is, you have your logo, you have your brand system, you have all of that stuff. If you can create some like meaningful tension there and actually answer a particular challenge within sort of like the set environment, then you could actually get investors. So then we actually created our own brands, and like we created a brewery, and then now that brewery is actually a successful brewery in San Diego. So I think there was like a deep sense of entrepreneurial spirit at Basic. There was a high investment in a lot of our own personal projects at Basic, and it just got rolled into sort of the Basic ecosystem. And so from that, a lot of the things I do now are like based on every single learning that I took away from Basic. And then even how I manage like people and manage other creatives also came from this idea of how do I just spark the entrepreneurial spirit within you by showing you the power of your skill set to actually impact change in society. Right. So for me, those are like the two things that show up day to day in every single piece of work that I do still.
I love that. There's so many things that we can dive into just right here. I wanted to start with a line that you had said, this meaningful tension. Could you help define that meaningful tension? And then maybe we can dive in a little bit more.
Yeah. So I think it has multiple meanings. I use it a lot, but in a lot of different ways.
Okay.
So for me, meaningful tension on like a one-to-one scale where you're like interacting with another person, the meaningful tension is actually having something that you don't agree on, but you're willing to sit there and actually have meaningful change based on that disagreement, and you come out as a better person, whether you still disagree or not, but now you're taking in another perspective. Meaningful tension from like an advertising standpoint and campaign standpoint is like looking at the cultural tensions that exist within society, and then how is your brand or your organization uniquely slated or suited to actually answer the call of that tension, right? So I don't have any in mind, but that's like, to me, those are like the two pieces of meaningful tension on a macro scale and then a micro scale. And then for me, meaningful tension and sort of answering meaningful tension or utilizing meaningful tension still show up in all of the work I do right now. So even if it's like a dinner series that I'm running, the dinner series is focused on how do we actually create opportunities for meaningful tension. So you'll bring together 12 people, you have a topic that's super high level, but then you actually have people dig super deep into these like prying moments and prying topics. And so in that way, you're creating opportunity for meaningful tension and growth, right? So for me, meaningful tension in both ways and in both aspects, whether it's micro or macro, advertising scale or like one-on-one scale, is about creating opportunity for growth.
To go off of that same point, and maybe it's a career tension that I had opportunities both with We Like Small. They were potentially going to hire me, but also with Basic as a potential hire for the Google team. And I wasn't able to lock down the job with We Like Small because they had some sort of effect that they weren't hiring anymore. And then I was about to move to New York to be with my now wife, and we were going to find a way to find an apartment together and start that part of our life and journey. So that went off the table as a career path, which led me to freelancing, which led me to create Rogue. And it's only looking back at these connection points that there was tension and I didn't know exactly what I was going to end up doing, but it helped define me and become a part of my story. And that tension helped lead me to become the man I am now.
Yeah, I like that. Because even me sort of like leaving Basic, there was that moment where I had to like really sit and think like, what am I doing? Why would I leave? This is like, this is a great agency, great opportunity. And like, since I had been there for so long, there was so much opportunity to not have to like build from the ground up, but now I can actually help shape this larger organization. And it wasn't because I had learned everything I needed to learn, but there came a point, obviously with George Floyd, with everything that was happening in the world, where I had started to feel internal tension of me using my story and the knowledge that I had based on like the culture that I'm a part of to then help grow these like larger organizations where I wasn't seeing them investing back into the community. And so that tension is what led me to create the first t-shirt. And then that t-shirt ended up selling like 10,000, five to 10,000 like individual units in like a weekend. And so that arose like some actual internal tension of like, okay, do I stay at Basic? Do I leave and like really take everything I've ever learned at Basic and then pour it into myself at this given time? And so for me, that was like this deep internal tension that I started to feel. And that tension was building over time. And then it felt like it came to a head at that moment. And then the answer to that tension was me creating this shirt. And then that shirt leading to a pathway out, which is why I always say, like, when people are like, "Oh, was this a plan?" It definitely was not a plan to start a clothing brand at all.
I've heard that art is sometimes defined as tension and release. Definitely with jazz, where there's a tension with the dissonance in the notes, and then there's this kind of relief when you hit like a chord or some sort of state where the band is really kind of flow and it feels like natural. And it seems like life can be that as well, and we can learn from that experience. I had this quote from an article. It was the summer of 2020, 3 months into the pandemic, at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests across the world. You created a series of shirts to raise proceeds for organizations supporting the groundwork of policy and change. Were you still at Basic at this time?
Yeah, I was at Basic most of 2020 still. So that's where it was like, I'm managing this now growing fashion company. And the reason I say that like that, because I was like, this wasn't a thing that I wanted to do. I made the shirt initially, again, as a piece of art. And because at Basic, I had started running that dinner series that I was just mentioning.
Yeah.
And that dinner series, in order to make it cooler than just the dinner series, I started making merchandise. And I was like really inspired by what was happening within streetwear, what Virgil Abloh was doing, and how it was giving more meaning to streetwear, and giving more meaning to space, and sort of like looking at that as a 360 experience where it's space, art, fashion, food, senses, everything. And so with that, t-shirts became a canvas for words. And for me, if I always say, like, if I could have painted, I would have painted something. If I was a good poet, I would have done poetry. If I could sing, I would have made a song. But for me, my skill set and how I respond to things is typography and then words, which is why all the t-shirts have a lot of words on them. And it was almost like me writing my feelings in that moment, when I was feeling that deep tension, and then putting it on the canvas of a t-shirt. And I just made like a mock-up and posted it on Instagram, not expecting it to sell at all. And then when people started asking, like, "Hey, where can I buy this shirt? Where can I buy this shirt?" That's when I put it on Shopify, and I was like, "Oh, I'll raise $700." And then that was like my concept of like what this can do. I'm like, this is not going to make anything. I'll just raise $700. I still have my job at Basic, so that's my salary. Raise $700, donate that $700, and it won't be me talking about donating it. But then again, in that first weekend of it being available, we sold, like, again, I don't remember the exact number, but it was between 5,000 to 7,000 individual units, because it was like 5,000 orders. But then with that, it was like a lot of there was a huge influx of money in my own personal bank account, which is like super risky from a tax standpoint. But it allowed me to then donate to a lot of different organizations. And when I saw that, how that made me feel was amazing, to be able to use my skill set in design to then create meaningful change, but then to also give people this artifact of the time that represented a moment in history that they could also use when they're going out and protesting, or just on a day-to-day basis, to subvert their sort of lived environment. So it was almost like in that moment, I felt like I had finally achieved, and this is like a new thought. It felt like I had finally achieved this this like desire to do art,
Mm.
like, as opposed to just design, as opposed to just that thing. Because that's what I was always like. Maybe that's always what I was fighting up against. I'm like, I want to do art. I want to do art. I want this to have like deep meaning, but also reflect my own personal perspectives and how I see the world, which is not like a myopic perspective. It's like, how do I tell this story of like the beauty that I see in the world through these different projects? And this was the first time that I was really able to do it, and it felt like a piece of art. And then there was like some museums who reached out and they're like, we want to like archive this for this time in history.
Wow.
Like archiving a lot of protest pieces. So for me, it was like that first shirt still is like it was a moment in time in my life where I was like, this is like a beautiful sort of alignment of everything.
I hope that you framed it, or it's up somewhere as like an archival moment for you.
Oh yeah.
But I have to go back, because selling that many shirts in a weekend is like mind blowing to me. Is there anything that maybe it was that you had a network at the time? Maybe it was, I don't want to say capitalizing, maybe it was riding the wave of culture and that feeling at that moment. Is there anything that you can look back on and think of how this shirt became such a success at that moment in time?
Well, I think it was, again, very similar to advertising. What makes a great ad? It was saying what we're all thinking, or what makes a great piece of art. It was saying what we were all thinking, but might not have the words to say. So to me, that's what it was doing, and it was doing it in like a layout that looked good, right?
Yeah.
It's something that people could wear. So that has become sort of a core foundational element of Future is Color as a brand, which is why we don't release like traditionally or seasonally all the time. It's more like when there's something to say about what's happening in the world, or there's something to say about what's happening in the world, then I release something. So I think, again, it wasn't capitalizing on the moment, but it was really what made it successful is that I was being true to who I am, and I said how I was feeling, and how I was feeling was how a lot of people were feeling at that time.
I think I'd like to touch on the emotional side of making that shift, because not everything is sunshine and rainbows. Not everything is easy, that's for sure. So obviously you probably had a little savings, you had your community in San Diego, but what was that shift for you on an emotional level? And how did that transition feel? Because it seems like you kind of made not just a career pivot, but almost like an identification shift between like maybe designer to artist. And I believe that they're both connected, and design is art, but was that a mindset shift for you?
I think it was a mindset shift for me, but again, everything has a starting point, and it all still started with my family. And so I think that what I had learned during childhood and what I had seen my family doing was slowly creeping back up as my skill set in design had begun to really align with my passion for community. And so as those two things came to head, which was during the pandemic, that's when it felt like it was almost a no-brainer to leave. So I think that's, again, when I started the brand, that's when I did that whole retrospective and looked back at my life, and I was like, oh no, this is what I'm supposed to do. If I don't do this, it will be a disservice to the thing I actually love doing, because it will always be sort of a side project or on the back burner. As well as shipping 5,000 shirts. It was like, I have to do that. I can't not ship the shirts. So I think that also became like, there was like a thing that I actually had to do. There was a task that I had to do. There was a task at hand. But then from an emotional side, there was like, I felt deep alignment in what I was doing. And so it made the decision to step away from the agency space a little bit easier, right? And then because it was doing well, I think the finances weren't necessarily as big of a concern, because when we would do releases, we would sell a lot of shirts. So then I was still able to sustain my living and my lifestyle based on that. But I think that wasn't, even if it wasn't selling, I think I still would have left. Mainly because, again, I had almost found a sense of peace in what I was doing, as opposed to some of those moments where I would be presenting, and not saying, because I've gone back and I still do like consulting work or contract work, or I still work within agencies, but it was like at that particular moment when I had this like brand starting to grow, and then I had the restaurant group also starting to do things within community. And we were like, with the restaurant group particularly, before I started Future is Color, we were feeding families in need during the pandemic. And we were feeding like over, I forgot the exact number, but I believe we fed over like 300,000 families who had lost their jobs in San Diego. So again, just seeing like, going back to childhood, the things we create can actually impact meaningful change within our local communities. Seeing that and then having the clothing sort of take off, it was like, oh, I need to really honor these things. And I feel a sense of deep ownership over the trajectory of these, and the fact that people are really resonating with it means something. Means I need to give more time and give myself to it. And like you said, it wasn't easy, and it still is definitely not easy, especially when the whole brand is based on like almost like me putting out my journal, and my journal entries, and like telling a lot of myself and exposing a lot of myself. There's always that like pushback of like, hey, you're not really like that, or hey, you hurt me like 2 years ago and now you're talking about empathy. And I'm like, we're all still growing. We're all still sort of like on this pathway and journey to empathy. And so there's also just a lot of tensions that I've had to deal with through the creation of the brand and the journey of the brand as well.
I wanted to get a little bit tactical because, you know, you're mailing 5,000 shirts. You got payments through the Shopify store to your personal account. So I'm assuming you had to switch it over to some sort of business entity. And what was the process like of getting these 5,000 shirts made and shipping them out? Are they all just sitting in your house? Are you using a warehouse? What are the logistical things that you had to do to make this kind of machine run?
It's not universally applicable, so it's always hard to sort of apply this. But when I say there was like certain universally aligned things that were happening at a given time, and then it was just me sort of stepping into a place where I could receive those things. With the restaurant group, we ended up not being able to meet all the time in coffee shops, which is where we would get all of our ideas out of the way. You're like, oh, we're going to start this restaurant. We're going to do this, do this, do this. And that provided us a lot of energy. But when the pandemic hit, then we were no longer able to meet at coffee shops. But then what happened is where one of our partners, where he would get his motorcycle fixed, they moved out of that space. And then we acquired that space as a restaurant group. Not acquired, like bought it, but we started renting out this space as a restaurant group just so we had a place to meet. That happened before I got those orders. So if I had got those orders and I didn't have that space, then it would have all just been in my house. Everything would have had cat hair on it. It would have never gotten shipped. But because we had already had that space and we were only using it to meet once a week, I then just asked, could I actually bring all of those 5,000 something shirts in here, and can I ship it out of here? And then at that same time, there were some kids who were skateboarding outside of that like shop that we have. And then I just asked them if they would be open to folding and helping ship these shirts, and they were down. And so to me, it wasn't that it wasn't work, but it was that a lot of the pre-existing work that we had put in to do all of these other things enabled me a smoother transition into this sort of like space of fashion, right? And so, like I knew I could not ship it out of my house. That was not going to happen. And then because I was running the dinner series at Basic, like before that, I had no clue how to print shirts. I like zero clue. But while running the dinner series at Basic, once I started wanting to actually make shirts as takeaways for all of the guests, then I started looking around and I found like a print shop, and I had developed a good relationship with them over 18 months. So then by the time it was like, I have 5,000 shirts to print, I understood that they could handle it and they could do it, and they would do it at a very high level. What was really cool about that is then that print shop ended up growing alongside our orders. And then they started working for larger brands as well. So it was like this nice sort of symbiotic mutual relationship between these two local organizations, local institutions, local brands that were able to help build one another.
Do you want to shout out the name of the print shop for anyone in the area to leverage or utilize?
Oh yeah, Daly's Workshop. I was going to say they print for brands all around the world. So
sweet.
They can do their print quality. I feel like I'm gonna like hype them up. Their print quality is some of the best print quality I've ever had. Even me manufacturing stuff and doing cut and sew stuff now, their print quality is still one of the best. And they print it for like Golf Wang, if people know what that is. They print for Hypeland, which is a brand out of LA. So they print for a lot of really big brands, but then they have high investment in sustainability. They're buying farms to like help make sure they're testing out their inks and doing organic inks and all this other stuff way beyond what I know from the fashion standpoint. But they're deeply invested in like creating a highly sustainable process from manufacturing to printing.
When you were starting the dinner series at Basic and you started getting into the shirts, the side of it, how did you look at printing partners or vet printing partners in order to get to Daily?
It was just a lot of groundwork. So that's again where like while I was at Basic, I did a lot of the groundwork to do a lot of these things. So I was just like looking online and just doing a bunch of research because I knew I wanted to print it locally, and then ended up finding Dailies after looking at probably 20 different print shops around town, which again, I had no clue was even a thing. Like, I feel like whenever I would see a graphic tee, it just existed. And I was just like, that's just what it is. It's just a graphic tee. I don't know how that got there. I didn't think about how I got there. But then when I finally was like, we want to make t-shirts, then it became, again, that like deep process of like, what are the different print shops, just going on Google and researching, and then calling around to every single one of them, going on site, seeing how they printed. And then through that process, also learning about like the blanks and the base garments and all that stuff. That's also what's been exciting about this sort of stage of my journey is like with design. And when I joined Basic, it was about learning all of these new skill sets, from key art to digital to app design to whatever program was out. Now it's like learning fabrics, the silhouettes, the manufacturing process, and working with large teams. Even if I'm an individual who's running Future is Color, working with like large teams outside of Future is Color to build and manufacture, make product and make sure it's sustainable. And then how do I now deliver it to like FootLocker and all of these other things? So there's such joy in not knowing anything that like sparks almost like this, like I'm back in school and I'm like doing research and I'm trying to understand these new tools and these new things. But ultimately I came around to like Dailies because they were a young organization. They were willing to work with us to like test new inks. And that's what, and again, that's a way we like sort of mutually grew together, because a lot of our stuff would be like, let's do a scratch and sniff ink because you have it, let's try it. So then they would start like testing it out. They would like perfect it, the puff print. They would like perfect the puff print with like some mistakes on our garments. But because we're just doing it as like free takeaways for people, it was like there was more room for play, if that makes sense.
I think that's an important piece of it, the room for play and finding a partner that is willing to have that relationship with you. I think it was probably 6 to 8 months after you released your first Future is Color series. We did a little print series, rogue promotional stuff, but we did it as orders where you had to pre-order so that we weren't like wasting materials and we just knew exactly who we were shipping to. But we formed a relationship with a print partner. Shout out to the Brooklyn Press in New York. And then also, well, they're in Brooklyn, but they're also upstate New York as well. They have a bigger facility. And we formed a relationship because the owner really liked the designs and wanted some for himself. And we just formed a really like beautiful mutual relationship. And I wasn't trying to get a deal or anything. And we just kind of fell into a working relationship that worked for us. And I think it just goes to show, if you form that community, you reach out to people, you want to work with people who are like-minded and interested in what you're doing, there's benefits beyond just what you assume is getting the product at the end of the day.
Oh yeah, because even from him, I've learned a lot. Just from the print standpoint, the ink standpoint. Again, like I said, I had no clue how to make a shirt. So then I didn't even know you had to make tech packs, or I didn't know you had to like give measurements. I was just like, you just put it on the mock-up and they just print it based on the mock-up.
Yeah.
And then learning that you have to, just like any digital experience in the past, you had to like redline stuff. So it's like you actually have to like go in and provide so many measurements and so much detail. But it was through them and me not giving them that, and they were still able to print. But then as I started to like continuously like work with them, they were like, oh yeah, this should probably be this far down. This should be this size. This should be this. So it was a nice, again, that's why I said mutual sort of relationship where there was an exchange of knowledge back and forth.
It seems like you have to be a bit naive or maybe a bit of an optimist in order to run a business. I think it comes with the entrepreneurial spirit, because if we knew all of the trials and tribulations or the amount of work, I don't think anyone would start a business.
No, like if I knew how much, like getting into cut and sew, if I knew how much upfront cost you would have to put out to actually make real clothes, yeah, I would have never done it. Like if somebody told me that when I was at Basic before I left, they're like, oh, it's going to cost you this much per year to actually make a set of t-shirts or hoodies and all that stuff that you really want to wear. It's going to cost you this much. I would be like, oh, I'm gonna stay. Sure. or even like with studio sessions, like the newest project, that's like another thing where going into it, not as an event organizer, not as a club promoter, not as a musician, but just as someone who just likes experiences and likes to utilize space for community, going into it with that perspective, then I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be grand. And I didn't think it was going to be easy, but I was just like, yeah, this is going to be, it's just going to be this thing we do. It's going to be this, that would be this side thing. But then that in and of itself has taken up so much like energy and time in like the most beautiful way. But if somebody would have said that to me before, I would have been like, no, why would I do that? I'll just go to someone else's jazz night.
Exactly. There's already clubs or restaurants. There's jazz musicians. I'll see them there.
Exactly.
I think we're pivoting on the line of like open gym, crafted, and kind of the ecosystem that you've created. And I wanted to touch upon, when did crafted, the dinner series at Basic start? And then where did Open Gym come, this hospitality group that you formed? Well, where's the intersection in the line? When does something become the next? And what is that journey?
Yeah, I was going to say, even when we talked about that idea of when I was sitting in the park, and that idea of lineage of work, and everything has like something that like its predecessor that it was influenced by. For me, crafted was a thing that I created at Basic because, one, there's a lot of like really interesting creative folk in San Diego, but a lot of them just weren't connected. And how that came about is that I would go to this coffee shop every day. My now friend worked at that coffee shop as barista, and then he'd be like, oh, do you know this person? He's like, he lives in San Diego. Do you know this person? He lives in San Diego. How don't you know that person? And he had his own podcast, and he was just meeting all these people as a barista in the center of like downtown San Diego. And so as me and him just begin to talk, we're like, you know what we should do? We should just like get people together for coffee and just like, this person needs to meet this person. This person needs to meet this person, because when we see how many creative folk actually live in San Diego, maybe it will reduce the amount of creative attrition out of San Diego. And then how Basic got involved was because we also had a really hard time securing talent that would move to San Diego from New York, from LA, because they would come down here or they would come over here and they'd say like, where's the community? Like it's hard to just like move to a place just for an agency, even if the work is great, because what if I leave that agency? Now I have to leave San Diego because there's no other like creative community to sort of like be embedded in. And it was like through him. And then now we were building this little network of like this barbershop, this dancer, this musician, this chef, this. We were building that and saying like, wow, San Diego actually does have a very vibrant, energetic, creative community. It's just very separated. And it's not like there's no connecting threads, right? There's no place to just like serendipitous is that, how do you, what is the other way to say sales?
Serendipitous? Is that it?
Yes, I always mess that up.
That's a hard one.
There's no place for that sort of interaction to really happen. And so again, going back to like Washington Square Park, where like you see everybody and everything intermingling, the chaos of life happening all in one place. So the dinner series started in 2018. The goal from basic standpoint was, how do we actually reinvigorate a creative community, show that there's a creative community here so that we can actually begin to draw more talent. From me and a community standpoint, it was like, let's help reduce creative attrition so that we can actually have a vibrant creative economy in San Diego. And when you have a creative economy, then you also have a younger demographic who are more likely to be more civically invested in sort of like the local environment and all that stuff. So there was like, it was almost like this dual sort of like tactic that I was trying to communicate through it. But started that in 2018, ran it up until 2020. Like we had the last one February, right before the pandemic hit. And then at that point we were growing it past just a dinner series. So then we had started to work with like individual artists to help like shine a light on them, because now the sort of like Instagram account of Crafted had grown to have like 3,000 something followers, and they're all local. And then each event we would do, people would show up. So then we ended up finding this artist who we really, really liked, but she was having a hard time again staying in San Diego because the value placed on our art was very low. So she couldn't sell her art to sustain her lifestyle, but her art was really, really good. And so then we held an art gallery for her, like a solo gallery experience, where we worked with her for a month to help her curate and shape that like message around that art. We ended up getting like 500 something people, and then pandemic. So there was like this like beautiful growth and trajectory. But how I met all of the Open Gym people was actually through the dinner series. So at the second dinner we had, who is like the executive chef and partner of Open Gym, Philip Esteban. He was the second chef. After he was the chef, he was like, I love what this is, and I just want to be a part of it. And then so he came on with the Crafted series as like the chef curator, because he just had way more knowledge of all of the chefs. And he started plugging all of these individual chefs. And then through that, we actually ended up finding a lot of the people who now work with Open Gym as chefs for the different restaurants. And so it's almost like Crafted, even though it was with Basic and then for the city, it started to help me build that network to then launch Open Gym. And it was like maybe month like 16, we actually launched Open Gym with the intention of taking a lot of those same concepts of like creating intentional space. How do you use food and art to create meaningful tension and space for conversation and create these like opportunities for collision? We started taking that and started building out the principles of Open Gym. And then even from the pandemic really pouring into Open Gym, we launched our first restaurant concept right before the pandemic hit. Yeah, right before the pandemic hit. But then we were able to pivot to like a purely delivery model. And then that said, like, there's so much happening within San Diego from not only nurses and not only like the people on the front line and that sort of stuff, but all of the families who are losing their jobs. So we started a direct to consumer delivery service where you just DM us and we'll bring you the food. But then we took the money or a portion of those proceeds and then made additional meals for those families in need. And then we worked with our network of fishermen and all of that stuff to provide, again, meals for families in need. And then ended up getting a contract with World Central Kitchen, who helped support a lot of the programs around the nation from government funding to make sure that families in need were being fed. So we became the main kitchen for operating with World Central Kitchen in San Diego, which again helped bolster and propel that feeding families in need during the pandemic. And then from that, it was taking a lot of those concepts and like really digging deeper into sort of like the communal aspects of how you can use food, space, and that type of stuff. And with each one of those experiences, I would also, again, design merch and design the brands to feel a little bit more like culturally relevant or streetwear based.
Yeah.
And that led to sort of this organic transition into Future is Color, because it was like, again, that tension, I couldn't answer that tension through Open Gym, because Open Gym is a pathway to really explore Filipino culture. So my grandma's Filipino, so it allows me to explore that side. So I needed another house to almost like answer the call of what was happening with Black Lives Matter and how I was feeling about it. And so that then like created Future is Color. And even the name Future is Color was not the name at first. It was just Erwin Hines. And I felt like I needed to create separation between me as an individual so I don't become defined by this one thing that I'm constantly putting out.
Mm-hmm.
And I can actually put it into a different house, which became Future is Color. And then within Future is Color, there was also some educational programs as well.
A lot to unpack, but I wanted to touch on Open Gym and the founding people inside of that organization. So there's yourself, there's a restaurant, I'm going to say the wrong thing. There's executive chef, for lack of a better word. Who else is inside of this organization and the roles and responsibilities?
So we actually founded it based on the principles of like cross-disciplinary collaboration can create beautiful things. And so I was the brand design, marketing. We had an interior designer and architect. We had somebody else who functioned in the dance world, but grew and helped build some of the largest dance crews in the world.
Oh, wow.
So he brought more of like this entertainment and how do you actually like make things like super fun to attend and be a part of, and how do you create larger community within that, and also just really great at negotiating. And then we had the chef. So again, it was like there was no business people in this entire sort of partnership. Now we have somebody who is within the real estate space. So he has a deep knowledge of real estate, understanding of real estate. We still have interior designer, architect. So we've expanded it like plus one person. But again, the goal was to take this cross-disciplinary collision that we were speaking about through Crafted and trying to champion through this dinner series we were running together, and then showing the actuality or the reality of what happens when you actually stand on that and bring different backgrounds together to create something special.
What has the impact of starting Crafted and Open Gym? What is the impact that it's had on the city of San Diego and the community at large? Have you received like any messages from people or kind of seen any tangible kind of results of creating that community and piggybacking the artist community and giving them a space to really be and exist together and share?
I think with Crafted specifically, we saw that initial goal happen. We saw more creatives actually getting connected with other creatives who they wouldn't have otherwise been connected with. And we saw more projects starting to happen between those individual creatives, which then created more energy and people were staying. So then we saw a bunch of events, not because of our event, but we saw a bunch of other things start to pop up around the city that were creating a lot of energy that made young creatives want to stay, and then even begin to draw people from LA to just come visit San Diego. Because with our dinner, we would always invite like one person or two people from LA, just to subvert their perspective of San Diego, to say like, wow, come down here and see these amazing creators that exist here. So yeah, there was definitely some like tangible results that happened, particularly from Crafted. And then we always would get reached out to, like Basic would get reached out to, and then I would get reached out to via the Crafted account, asking like how to build it. How do I do this in my city? So it became something where I was like talking to just a lot of people in order to help them understand how to create that sort of community and how to create an intentional series, whether it's dinner or whatever, but an intentional series that can connect disparate people within the community and do so in a way that wasn't, because the dinner series was also 100% free, but you get like a 5-course meal. And then we started opening it up to say like everybody actually needs to be involved in this. So we would invite students, we'd invite activists and community leaders to sit next to somebody who works in biotech, to sit next to somebody who works in architecture. So now you're creating this really dynamic space for ideas and sharing ideas. And a big principle of that dinner series was that typically when you go to these things, you're going to introduce yourself based on what you do, which then starts this whole networking sort of like spiral where everybody's just networking and what can I do for you? How can I serve you? How can you serve me? We would take it up a notch, or like we would almost like we would remove that by having a larger theme. So one of the themes, for example, was identity. And so instead of people sitting down and saying like, introduce yourself by saying who you are and what you do, we would say, tell us what's your name, where you're from, and when was the first time you felt like you had your own sense of identity. And so that was the first question that people would get to know you by.
Wow.
Then it's just getting people to know each other based on their humanity. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's also a reflection of, again, my perspective on what design should be: human driven, humanity driven. How do you use these spaces and places to leave impactful change and space for growth?
It seems like you're a very busy individual. What is the amount of time that you spent on either, whether it's your breakdown of time invested in Open Gym versus Future is Color? How do you balance all of that? And what does a typical day look like in the life of Erwin Hines?
I don't think there's a typical day. There is absolutely no typical day in my life. There's my morning ritual, and then there's evening, but everything in between is like beautiful chaos. So it's like I typically try and wake up at like 5 a.m. and then I have like time to meditate, which can be working out, reading, activating the mind, activating the body, so that I have a little bit more like structural control over what is going to be a chaotic day always. But there is no like, I have zero like hard splits in anything. I think in general, I just follow, this is going to be a whole thing within, maybe it's like a through line through this whole conversation. Just Erwin just lives a chaotic life, and he just follows what feels good in the moment. But that is truly during my day. It's like, one, what needs to get done, I'll get that done. But outside of that, how can I just put little pieces of energy into each one of these projects every single day? And I think I try and reduce any context switching in general by saying like, what's an overlap between all of these projects? So like whether it's studio sessions and the jazz nights, or a new collection with FootLocker, or with Future is Color, or with Open Gym, it's aligning all of those things, to maybe like one sort of like key theme that I'm working on and working through in my life for that month. Hopefully that works. Like for me, like this last season of life has been studio sessions, but then the last collection I released for FootLocker was actually all focused on music and honoring sort of the legacy and trajectory of like Black music. And then with Open Gym, it was about activating all of our spaces with music as well. So it became a little bit easier to like manage across all these different projects that seem disparate. For me, when I find those like moments of alignment in all of them.
Is that a cultivated moment of alignment? Did you kind of have this thought of, or maybe something in your life became super intentional, so you were focusing on music as a theme and it translated across all of the things that you were doing? Or was that just like a harmonious moment where it all just connected?
Harmonious.
Okay.
Yeah, this is like, I think a lot of stuff in life is harmonious. Like a lot of stuff in life is just, you've done all of the work up until now, and now there's opportunities that you can just find alignment within, if that makes sense. And I think that's for everything and always. Just like me saying I never wanted to be a creative director, it was just me constantly wanting to get better at my craft and my skill set, and that at that time was my core focus. And as I got better at that craft and that skill set, creative director was already there. And then I think I just follow that same principle in most things.
Insane and amazing that you have created this partnership with FootLocker. And I imagine that there could be potential other brands in collaboration with Future is Color, but I'm sure that there's a interesting, harmonious, divine story about that connection if you're willing to dive into it.
Yeah, I'm totally down to share. Because again, this is more like what you put out is what you're going to receive. So somebody at FootLocker had purchased one of the shirts and then had been following the brand. When they opened up more applicants for what they call their LEAD program, which is them investing in young Black businesses, and bringing them into their organization, he directly reached out to me via Instagram, which is how I receive all messages for most messages. He directly reached out to me through Instagram and said, would you like to apply for this? Just need you to put together a deck and just like something about the brand. And again, me going back to my agency experience and putting together decks, I'm like, oh yeah, I'll put together a deck. So I put together like a whole brand deck and got all the like the best images and all that stuff. And then just sent that over. And then they ended up reaching back out to me like a month and a half later to begin to like talk about what that relationship could look like and how that relationship could develop. Funny thing, and maybe not so funny, but like this is just another example of sort of like every single opportunity presents more opportunity for growth. And so with this opportunity, in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, gonna be in FootLocker. That means I really need to elevate and up sort of the standard of the garments and the things that I'm working on. And I had already started wanting to get into cut and sew. And I was like, if I send them this like crazy collection with knitwear and all of this other stuff that I had no clue how to make, I was like, they obviously have manufacturing. They're FootLocker. They're gonna make it. And then I sent them the collection, super excited about it, with like particular drawstrings and like fits and all this stuff. And then they're like, okay, we'll buy this. Now go ahead and make it. And I was like, oh, okay. But then, and I had no connections to manufacturers at that time at all. And so I was just printing on pre-existing blanks, whether it's LA Apparel, Comfort Colors, and all of that stuff. And those brands typically don't have like the full outfit or something that you like. They're not going to have the full thing based on what I presented. And so at the beginning of that year, I had gotten connected with the Utah Jazz. So I did like a collaboration with the Utah Jazz. Through that collaboration, I met one of their designers. And then he happened to be in San Diego at this time that I was going through these like mental tensions of like, how do I deliver this collection? I can't make any of this stuff. He came into my shop down in Barrio Logan and he was like, oh yeah, my friend actually manages manufacturing for a lot of brands. I'll connect you. And then ended up getting connected with him. And then through that, I began to dive in from the first FootLocker collection till now. Every collection has now been cut and sew and all manufactured based on like particular specifications. But it all came through, again, these sort of like these universal divine alignment of connections and being open to particular opportunities.
Just riding the flow of the universe, the manifesto of Erwin Hines. So with that partnership, is it just cash down on the table? Like you're fronting the money for these collections, but they're buying a certain X amount of garments in certain sizes?
Yeah. So they basically buy wholesale from me and then they sell.
Oh, okay.
So with that, I have to put up all of the money to make the clothes. And then it's not like they take a super long time to like actually pay you. So once you deliver, you just send them the invoice and they'll pay you for it. But that was like also a new thing for me. Actually like putting down that much money to make, because with this last collection that should be releasing in February, we just did the photo shoot for it. We had to produce over 1,000 something items. And then obviously that cost a good deal of money. But yeah, that's the relationship with FootLocker.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense that they would run it that way. I guess going back to that initial partnership and that agreement, how did you know that you wanted to work with FootLocker? Is it a brand that you just grew up with, that you knew was run by people that were doing good work? Or I'm going to not try to put words in your mouth, but how do you suss out a partner and how they're a good fit for the brand? I
think in general, I would look at the mission, the vision, and if I know somebody there and we actually, like if it's like an actual collaboration, typically if the energy feels good, I'll do it. And if I have an immediate idea, I'll do it. if I don't have an immediate idea or something isn't like sparked immediately through a conversation, then I typically don't do the collaboration at all. But with FootLocker, for me, it was looking at, this was like maybe the only business moment I've had in the entirety of Future is Color, which was like, oh, scale. We could actually scale the brand via this larger organization like FootLocker. And then it gives me the opportunity to highly invest into cut and sew. Without FootLocker, I don't know if I would have ever gotten into cut and sew, because I wouldn't have been forced to get into cut and sew. So it's almost like just like the I mentioned something else about, there was like, oh yeah, just like I had to ship all of those shirts. If I didn't have to ship all of those shirts, maybe I would still be at basic, because it was like you have to decide where you're going to put your time. Like I can't be on all of the creative director calls and all of the client calls if I'm shipping 5,000 shirts.
Yeah.
Like with this, I have to do cut and sew, or because I presented a bunch of cut and sew items. And so to me, that's another benefit of being in this relationship with FootLocker, has been that I get to grow as an actual brand and my knowledge of this world of fashion.
It's funny because I guess like entrepreneurial spirit mixed with a little bit of the naivety of not knowing about the relationship and how it'd be structured cues up that growth, and it's forced growth, which is the funny part about it. But I guess the thing is, we will rise to the occasion and the challenge as long as it's something that we really care about. So taking that passion and carrying it forward.
And maybe that was also another thing that I learned from Basic, because Basic was never where it is until it got where it is, if that makes sense. Like, so we had never worked with REI before we worked with an REI. We had never presented to a client like Google before we presented to a client like Google, but we ended up winning Google. So for me, there's never like a it's too big or it's too much or it's too far away to not go after it. It is like that naivete and like that childlike optimism of like, no, we can do this. Easy. Other people have done it. Like, let's go for it. And as long as it's like in that space of like passion and I'm still learning, that's what brings me a lot of joy. So like, even though manufacturing and like even with this collection, there's been a lot of like hiccups when I get something back and then everything's wrong and then I have to order a whole nother round and then it's late to deliver to FootLocker. Very similar to when you're working in the client services space, you never want to deliver something late. It always sucks to have to tell a client like the work isn't going to be done, but believe me, it's going to be really good when it is. It's like hard to say and hard to do, and you don't know how they're going to react. But it's the same thing with this sort of like relationship with FootLocker or any other sort of relationship that we would have, where you're still delivering this thing to this entity, into this organization. So there's always still those, it's hard, but there's so much like joy in that process of learning and that process of getting something back that's wrong because maybe you didn't know, or maybe like I didn't know how to like properly measure a pant yet, like in the first collection. And then now it's like, oh, that's how you measure a pant. That's what you do. That's what you do. That's the material. That's how you like call that particular piece out. So there's so much joy in like the mistakes, if that makes sense. Very similar to like, again, when I was first learning about design.
Yeah, it's just learning through the process of doing it and continuing to grow, and know that you'll continue to learn as you do new and challenging endeavors.
Yeah.
With the collection at FootLocker, is it nationwide? Is it in certain areas within FootLocker stores? How is that agreement set up when they are ordering product and placing product?
So what's cool is that FootLocker is a really good partner. Like it felt like they would be a good partner from the beginning, just because again, it was somebody who bought my stuff that reached out, and then through every conversation, it was very much looked at like, how can we help nurture you as a young brand and bring you up? And then the examples that they gave that they worked with in the past were like, oh, I know those brands, right? And so it was set up a lot of like, what's my data say? Where are my customers at? And then that's what they'll actually place the items in those stores. And so my data was like, we get some sales in San Diego, but not a lot. And our brand isn't like specifically like San Diego based, if that makes sense. or it's not, it has no wording that says San Diego. And so our main audience was then, the data was showing our main audience was like LA, New York, Chicago, Atlanta. To test it out, we launched first just LA stores and online. We had a huge online sales because that's where my main sales have been. And so with that first collection, I believe we almost sold out like in the first week of releasing, which was like really, really good, but it was mainly online sales. And so we looked at where those sales were coming from. And then from there, we were able to expand. So globally, I believe they have around like 6,000 stores. And so for me, looking at that, saying like, oh, how can I scale to be within as many stores as possible? Because one, with the messaging that's on these garments, it's focused on, again, creating space for conversation. And so even in looking at someone like that versus another organization, the fact that it can reach that many people then now puts it on the scale of what I was doing at Basic, which is working with Coach, working with Google, and being able to reach X amount of people, a particular message. So for me, that's what's exciting about working with someone like FootLocker is like, now we get to be or potentially be within 6,000 stores around the world. And then everybody who goes in there will get greeted with these powerful words or these powerful messages that might change how they're going about their day or might change their life, which might again be a naive thought, but that's the goal.
I think that is a beautiful goal. And there's two things that I wanted to touch on. One is, how do you vet partners? More specifically, what would make for a bad partner? And how do you notice those red flags and know that it's not the right vibe? And then two, this is for the audience specifically, because there's probably people listening that want to make their own apparel brand, want to get into kind of the streetwear scene, and are trying to listen to this conversation for something tactical for how they can create meaningful garments that cultivate community. So maybe let's start with the red flags for bad partners so that if they're at that point, they can learn from that, and then piggyback to the other question.
I think for bad partners, it'll be different for like, if it's a large organization that's like more of a retail space versus if it's an actual brand. So if it's a large organization that's a retail space, if they're just going to purely be trying to capitalize on your audience, and not necessarily give anything back from a growth standpoint to me as a smaller organization, then to me, that's not necessarily a good partnership, right? Because there's not really that much opportunity for scale over time if they're just going to be capitalizing, as well as they're not interested in the growth of your own brand or your individualized brand. And maybe that's, again, from this good experience with FootLocker, where there's like classes and partnerships with universities where you're getting to like sit with people who worked as like the brand director of Jordan and understand and learn from these individuals. To me, that's what a program should be, right? Like, you're actually helping to foster and build and give your network to smaller organizations. And it's something I believe in. So that's something that I would want to see in larger sort of like institutional partners, right? From a collaboration standpoint, I think it's when there is deep alignment on the mission, right? And if it's not just this person coming to you because they see your brand is doing well, and then again, they just want to capitalize. They don't have a particular vision. They don't have a mission. There's no alignment in what you guys want to do or what you believe in the world. That's where I was saying, if I'm having a conversation with somebody and there's not immediate ideas already sort of like turning in my head around how we can answer that particular cultural tension or that challenge and how we're both uniquely suited to do that, then I typically just don't collaborate with them. So I think it's, again, for me, applying the advertising design mindset to all partnerships, which is what tension are we actually answering? And typically the conversations for me have to be organic conversations where we're not talking about design. We're not talking about product. We're talking about, again, what's happening in the world. What are the cultural tensions? What are you doing as an organization to solve that? What am I doing as an organization to tackle that? Oh, wow, there's something really cool that we could do together here. Like, to me, that's how I approach most collaborations.
So bringing it back to the young kid or someone in their journey who loves apparel, who loves maybe streetwear, has an idea and wants to get it off the ground, is there any lessons from your experience that you could share about creating garments with meaningful message? Or
I use like meaningful garments, but like creating things that are deeply true to who you are. I would say, like with any art or any design, making sure you're telling your own story, right? Like that's what I'll tell any young person. Don't look at what other people are doing from a messaging standpoint. Maybe look at what other people are doing from like these little pieces and nuances of inspiration, where it's like, oh, they did this design treatment here, but you still need to have like a larger sort of perspective that you're putting into the world. And even if your designs are really cool, but you're not putting out that perspective, then you're doing yourself a disservice, and those who are like you a disservice, because they're still not being able to see their story told, right? So it's like, how do you utilize your skill set of design? If you're really good at design, if you're already making really cool clothes, how do you utilize that skill set to now tell a deeper, more nuanced message so people can begin to see themselves in what you're creating, beyond just a cool design, and feel, I don't know, feel seen. That's the purpose and role of good creative. Help people feel seen, and then help challenge the pre-existing held stereotypes.
Yeah, I think the part of branding in general is seeing yourself represented in that product, mission, service, company, and joining that conversation. So you're either a user of this product, company, service, brand, or you're a collaborator. And I think by wearing a garment from a brand, you are in essence a collaborator, because you're pushing that message forward.
Yep. I like that. That's well said.
It's on the spot. You can have it. Because you're not generating, I guess, product drops on like a kind of a fashion schedule in seasons, is there particular ways that you are trying to keep a steady maybe state of income in order to not have like drastic dips? Or are you just planning for kind of gaps in kind of income when certain things are not being released? Maybe that's a poorly worded question, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I just plan for gaps.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's more like having a certain amount in the bank, where it's like, if I don't work for X amount of time, I'll be comfortable still. That way there's not pressure on Future is Color to have to do anything, if that makes sense. Like, I don't want Future is Color to have to do anything. Like, if there are no employees, and that's intentional as well, because I don't want that responsibility of, like with Open Gym, we have employees. So it's not that I don't want the responsibility of employees, but I don't want to have to release things just to release things to make profit and money, when there's nothing that needs to be said. Yeah. So that's where Future is Color is still positioned as like an art project or an art experience that has these different sort of like ways to enter in, right? And so one of the monetization things is studio sessions. So with studio sessions, that brings in a more consistent, that's another way to bring in additional sort of like income underneath the Future is Color experience.
Gotcha. And I guess just to cue it up, let's maybe jump into studio sessions is a project and or sub brand under Future is Color.
That is correct. One of like the biggest joys in my life has been entering into space and being deeply impacted by space. Whether it was in New York, in Washington Square Park, being impacted by that space and the people within that space, going to the Whitney, being impacted by that space and the people in that space, going to the Comedy Cellar, being impacted by that space and the people within that space. Those things dramatically changed my life, or my life. And then also going to these different jazz clubs in New York dramatically changed my life. And so for me, creating studio sessions was an opportunity to utilize space to really help transform community for the good by just providing a space for people to gather around music in particular. And now I actually have like a whole case study for a studio session that I launched at the end of at the beginning of this year.
When was the first moment that you fell in love with jazz? Or maybe a flipping of that question is, when did jazz enter your life?
Dang, that's a good question. I would more so say music in general.
Let's
I
do
fell
it.
in love with music in general. Just growing up in my household, also growing up in the church, we had a concert like every Sunday with like beautiful vocals, beautiful instrumentation. So growing up with that, and then also growing up with a family who was just always listening to like Marvin Gaye, Ohio Players, and then later on in life getting introduced to the Funkadelics and like hearing that. And then we would always go to concerts like all of the time. And I didn't realize how lucky it is. Like I would go see Earth, Wind and Fire like multiple times live, saw the Ohio Players live, saw the Isley Brothers live. And in my head, when I was younger, I'm like, I just want to see Nelly. Like, why are you taking me to see this old music? But for me, kind of looking back and realizing that I was being imparted with all of these sort of like the genius of music and some of the originators of these sounds, just really, again, looking at that lineage begin to like make more sense later on in life when I would go to these different spaces and listen to the music and go like, oh, this sound came from this came from this came from this. And then it also made me super open to all genres. So that's what I was saying. It's not just jazz that I love. Jazz was like the entry point for a more accessible space of music in San Diego.
Yeah.
Right. Me and my girlfriend just love jazz clubs because one, they're not spaces you have to go and you don't have to dance. You don't have to like get crazy. You can go relax, listen to a particular vibe. And jazz clubs in New York or other places outside of San Diego had like this underground feel to it. And so it was more like the environment plus the music and that energy created something really special. I think I also fall in love, like I love music in general and how it makes me feel, but then I fall deeper in love with things once I understand the history and the context of it. So understanding what jazz is, where it came from, understanding that it was a space where diverse groups of people were able to gather around this music. It was also influential in sort of the civil rights movement because it was a space where, again, diverse people were gathering. The fact that it was response to the popularization and the whitewashing of other genres, in that it was like a genre and a music that was more about a response and a conversation between the instruments, and it was not necessarily meant to sound great, but it did. Like that's like just such a cool idea that's really rooted in a culture that I grew up with, right? So whether it's gospel, the church, jazz, all the way to like house music and techno music. So for me, it's like all of these genres were created out of a space and a response to an oppressive environment, but it was created so that people could feel seen and have a thing to belong to and have a space to belong to. So it was more than the music, but it was like the things that came with the music and the culture that was around the music that I fell in love with, if that makes sense. So that's what it's like. It's jazz, but then it's also gospel, then it's also hip hop, then it's also rock, it's also country, it's also house music. It's every genre is so beautiful to me for the very fact that it was always a response to something before it. And it was always about creating safe space for a group of people who didn't feel safe in the space that was created before, right? And Absolutely. So it's like the creation of the use of jazz as our sort of like first studio sessions was deeply intentional in that. Like, how do I take this genre of music that was really influential in sort of like the movement of collective liberation, attach it to a brand that's focused on collective liberation and creating space for conversation, and actually create physical space that intentionally helps to liberate through this genre of music. And what's been super beautiful we launched our first one in February last year. And we thought, again, we were going to get like 20 people to come. We ended up getting like 80 people to come. And then from there, it's just like consistently growing. Now there's like 300 people who come every single week to come listen to jazz. And now we're helping to build and foster all of these young bands. But in doing that and in bringing that many people, we're actually helping to support the local businesses as well. So now the businesses that surround the studio are able to, they make like 400% increase on revenue on that one day. So now we're helping to sustain these other local businesses just from this one experience, which has, again, been one of these like beautiful byproducts that was not planned for, but now as a part of the sort of like deeper principles of the experience.
That's amazing. I mean, it seems like everything that you intentionally design, it may not be like just typography, color, but how you're intentionally designing experiences has a direct byproduct on the community, whether it's donating money with Open Gym on food or creating a music experience that has a byproduct of helping surrounding businesses. Is there a way of thinking that we can kind of diagnose in some way that we can take as the audience and use that to design projects in our own lives and benefit our own communities? Are there certain kind of things that we can take away?
I think it was always, even at Basic, we would ask the question to some of our clients, like what drives you beyond the money?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it always is. It's looking at the things that drive me beyond the profit. Like studio sessions was never started as a thing that was ever going to be profitable. Like it was like, I'm paying the band. I'm also, I rent my space. So that space I have to include in that cost because now I can't use it for retail. I'm paying the band, paying photographers. Other businesses are profiting. And for me, seeing that was a worthwhile investment. And so in that, it was like never about the money first. It was about what is that cultural tension and what does the community need? And then how am I uniquely positioned to help solve that, to help like step in, not as somebody who has all the right answers, but as somebody who can collaborate with community to co-create something. And so now for me, that's like with most projects, if not all projects, it's how do I collaborate and co-create something with the people who I'm creating it for? And then how is it addressing a particular tension that community is feeling? And so for me, like, again, that applies from advertising, app design, community work, Future is Color, and Open Gym.
Yeah, definitely looking at the upsides besides profit, understanding that mission, what it is that you want to achieve with the business event and insert thing here, and thinking about the aspects, what can this do besides just generate a little bit of money? Because I think there's too much of that in the world where you're either jumping on a trend in order to make just a little bit of extra. You're releasing a product just because you know it's trendy and it will be hot on the market currently, but eventually it'll just something that you cut and then just ends up in a landfill. I think we do have to be intentional about what we're doing, why we're doing it, so that we can effectively leave the world slightly better than we did yesterday.
And I feel like it's become even more real for me because, again, me and my girlfriend are expecting. So our first, thank you. Our first baby in March. So I'm like, oh, it's become even more real that all of these things that we're creating together are going to be something that he's brought into. And so how he brought into these things and have a legacy, again, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, a legacy of love, a legacy of joy, a legacy of investing in something larger than oneself, and not just being brought into a family where I'm always gone because I'm like chasing this opportunity, but I can be hyper present. It means that there might be struggle. And I'm not saying like there might be struggle, there might not be as much like financial wealth coming in, but then the time that I can spend and see and be in the pocket with this new human who's coming into this world, there's nothing that can replace that time.
Yeah.
So to me, like that was even like the thing when I left Basic, it was I've worked this long, I've gained these skills, I've done all this stuff besides like me like answering the call of a passion. It was, what am I doing it for if I can't buy back my time? That was like a big thing for me.
Yeah. Can't take it with you to the grave. Time is the one resource we can't really get back.
Yeah. Yeah.
It seems like your parents did a really beautiful foundational job of setting up like deep roots with you. So whether it was with music, understanding those connections, as well as books, and kind of learning history, are there any books that you think the audience has to read?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Let's do it.
All About Love by Bell Hooks. And then The Art of Loving by Eric Fromm are two books that like radically changed how I perceive most things, but it like connected all of these other things that I have taken in throughout life. Right. Like it was another moment of like alignment after reading both those books.
I think I've unintentionally started to pivot into like the section that I call like fast and fun questions. They don't have to be answered fast, but I think another thing that I'm personally super interested in is what musical artists have influenced you the most and left an impression on you? Man. Because I can talk about books and movies and music for like a whole another like 6 to 10 hours.
Yeah. It's like the first one is going to be a controversial one because it's like Kanye West, but it's mainly because when he came out, I was also kind of struggling with that identity of what it means to be a Black man in America. How do I have to show up? And then he was the first one that showed up how I felt like I was, which was I went to a predominantly white school. I don't have to try and be a thug or try and be like claim I'm like selling drugs or any of this stuff. So for me, that was like heavily influential. And then obviously from that, things like Kid Cudi, also being from Cleveland. And then going further back, it was Funkadelic and the song Maggot Brain in particular. Like, deeply impacted me just from I've always like loved riffs and guitar riffs and like just like beautiful instrumentation, but it felt like I was supposed to and I needed to like only hip hop, right? Or only this. And that was like just during the time that I was growing up. But then hearing that and learning that the Funkadelics are this amazing Black band and how they sort of perceived the world and they were like really, really, really outside of the box thinkers. That to me was something that transformed me, hearing that song in particular. And then from there, it's like Sun Ra and like, so then again, it like sent me on this other like journey of people who were like galactic and more like otherworldly in how they perceived sound and how they would approach their work.
I think the amazing thing about like Bootsy Collins and Funkadelic is they started as a Motown group and then they continued to evolve and they got the influence of like the space and the mothership from Pink Floyd and trying to be this incredible like stage, like I guess like arena band in a way. Yeah. And I just like, that's so amazing. I would never understand that connection to Pink Floyd. I know they do incredible lights and
yeah,
but knowing that they were inspired by every single genre of music and brought it in and combined it in their own unique way and put it out through their perspective just makes me appreciate them as artists so much more.
Oh, yeah. And then it's like Outkast is another one, like modern day version of that for me. That again just was like it just showed me that I could be whatever. Like that was like any music that I like is just music that's different. And I realize that now. It's like if it makes me feel something special or something different than what I'm already feeling from every other piece of music that's out right now, then I'm going to most likely really, really, really like it. Like even like Lil Yachty's last album was like really, really good because it was more rooted in sounds of like funk and sort of like it sounded more like a Funkadelic album. I was like, oh, this is so cool. And then also it's a lot. Cause I also love Chris Stapleton and like
Oh, okay.
his like soulful like
Mhm.
country song. Like, yeah. So yeah, anything that makes me feel
I'll throw out a couple of recommendations for you.
ease.
I think from a hip hop perspective, so he is from Brooklyn Heights. His name is Henry Canyons, is his stage name, but his family is French and he's Jewish, so he brings both of those cultures into the music. So he'll sometimes rap in French and then mention kind of like parts of like his Jewish culture. Not like a huge following, so I'm going to shout him out because I love his music, and his album Cool Side of the Pillow has been like on repeat for me just like since I learned about it from a friend. So I think you would really love that because it incorporates blues, jazz, incredible, just like chill flows. And it's just this blending of cultures. And then from the country perspective, and it's my favorite country artist. Oh gosh, the name just jumped out of my head. Give me 1 second to think about it. Is Sturgill Simpson, because he also does an incredible job of fusing the old school country and the songwriting and the storytelling and fusing other styles of music into it and making it feel like something new. And he's always like being like on the podium for like country music awards because he's always doing something different.
Yeah.
But I think he is under the radar as well and a true artist and a really beautiful musician.
I like this. Are you a fan of? What was another song that like Kavinsky's work? Also, like really.
Kavinsky.
He's like it's like songs that I play when I'm designing, like in deep like design synergy, and I'm like deeply focused.
Oh, okay. I'll check it out. I don't think I know that artist personally.
It's like it's in more of like a electronic realm, and it feels cinematic. So maybe that's probably a connecting thread through the music that I love is that it feels cinematic. So anything Hans Zimmer, but like Kavinsky.
Oh yeah.
What's it called?
I don't know if there's a specific connection that you have with music and fusing it into your design. Has it impacted you as a designer in the way that you physically create? I see that there's the creative act is on your desk. So I know that music is obviously important to you. I think like you have a Rick Rubin zen about you in a way, but I'll turn over the question to you.
When I'm designing anything, I have to put on something. Like sometimes I do put on cinema just because, again, it's more of the sound and the sonics of that will impact how I design. But music definitely. I don't know how in particular, but I know music deeply impacts how I will design and the output of said design. Right. So even with like this new collection that I'm working on and the marketing for it, I know that I'm going to be using jazz in the background. So I'm like playing that jazz as I'm designing, one, the collection, but then two, all of the marketing for that collection. As I'm editing all the videos, I'm listening to these different jazz tracks.
Any particular jazz artist that you are loving right now?
I like Kamal Williams. Things album, but I feel like I've just been playing Spotify. Like for this, like as I'm designing this stuff, it's just playing like Spotify, and I'll start with like a radio station from Kamal, and then I'll just let it build out, and then just like as it builds, I'm trying to find something that I haven't heard. I was gonna say I would selfishly also say like the bands that we have playing are some of my favorite because like the goal with it, like we work with one band throughout the entire year to help them build their brand, and then also help them like carve out a unique sonic texture so that they can begin making originals, and then we invest into an actual vinyl for them. So that they can then start like selling out their own shows with their own like originals. So my goal is to like help build these like young bands.
Are you the next Quincy Jones? Are you like going to be a record producer in the future, or?
Because I was gonna say that's also like another thing in this. Like we don't take any stake in the band, so there's no contracts. Me making the album is like I just want to make back the cost of production, and then they get all royalties, they get everything, so they own everything after that. So it's I feel like if I start thinking about it like I'm gonna be Quincy Jones or I'm gonna be like a record label, I feel like I would apply business logic, and I'm like, oh, I need all my money back. Me paying you for all of these shows playing throughout the year, I need that money back because that was essentially marketing or whatever. So that's why I'm trying not to approach it. It's like the selfish act for me in this is I just want more cool things in San Diego, especially bringing a new child into San Diego. I want him to have these things to go to when he's older.
This is an interesting question, but how has your relationship with the city changed from when you got there to now?
Oh, I hated it when I first. It was like following whatever. I didn't have an intention of moving to San Diego. Like I came out to California because my then girlfriend, she was at a program in Anaheim. So then I moved from Pittsburgh where I had a job to Anaheim. And then I like turned down an opportunity at White and Kennedy to come to Anaheim with no job. And then we just were in Anaheim for a year. I started applying to like places back in Chicago, had some opportunities, but then there was one place in San Diego that reached out to me based on my resume on Craigslist. And they're like, sight unseen, we'll hire you, come on down. And I was like, cool. So that's how we got to San Diego. And then when I was first here, coming from like Midwest and East Coast, where it just feels like there's a lot of investment on free space to engage with culture and art. And maybe that's because we have winter. And so then the cities know that like we have to do something to get people to come into these spaces during the winter, but to also keep people sane during the winter so that they know that there's this museum. They know that there's this thing. Like in Cleveland, you grew up with the orchestra and they always do free shows. So you're like listening to this amazing orchestra when you're like super young. And then you just take that as a given of like, this is just what cities have. Then you go to somewhere like New York and you're like, there's a bunch of free stuff to do during the summer, whether it's like the cinema in the park or they were doing this last summer where they had the dance festival and they're like doing dance shows all around the city as just pop-ups and you could just go. And I'm like, to me, that's what a city should feel like. So then when I came out here to San Diego, that's where I was like, do I need to surf? Is that my identity now? Like it's not going to be about art. It's going to be about surfing. And it wasn't until like year 4 that I found the community Barrio Logan that is sort of like the hotbed of art, culture, activism within San Diego. It's like the thing that feels most like Brooklyn.
Okay.
San Diego. So it wasn't until like year 3 or 4 that I actually started feeling at home here.
Gotcha.
So now it has definitely changed because there's less of me seeing like, oh, I need it to exist in order to find joy. It's more, we have the density. We have a bunch of amazing people from all different backgrounds and textures, but there's a whole swath and group of people that don't feel seen by the city because their story isn't told, promoted, shown by the city at all. When you look at San Diego from an outside perspective, you're like, you see beaches, you see breweries, you see like PV, all really beautiful and cool. But then there's this texture and this layer of like beauty and diversity that obviously has to exist here because we're a border town.
Yeah.
But for some reason that's like never talked about. But it's like that adds obviously so much texture and so much richness. And then we also have a lot of universities. So then you get a lot of kids from around the world. And then you have biotech. So you're getting a lot of diverse people coming here for biotech. Then you also have the military. And so you get people coming here for that. So you actually have like a lot of diversity akin to something like New York, where people are coming for a lot of different reasons. But the only thing San Diego ever shows is beaches. So it's like, to me, like now my goal with a lot of these different things is to like illuminate and reveal the beauty that has always been in San Diego and create spaces where all those different groups can collide.
I think this is a super important conversation for me in general. So my wife and I moved last October from Brooklyn to Cape Cod, Massachusetts. So outside of Boston, but it's just like a beach area, and it has a relatively low population in the winter. So a lot of things will close down because of the seasonality of the tourist season. And we moved there to be beach bums, to be closer to family. But there's obviously a very rich culture of the local community. And so for me, it's been like an interesting thought exercise and trying to wrap my head around, how do I bring the community, use my design skills, my people skills in order to create a space for whether it's, I don't know, music, art, culture, etc. My wife is an actress, so she's joined the theater community, and we've had that kind of really enrich our lives. So we have friends now. I'm kind of a nerd, so I play Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons with some folks out here, and that's like an easy way to use hobbies to gain a community. But also like this podcast, whether it's, I don't have people directly next to me, but at least I can try to meet people from around the world in case they're traveling to Cape Cod, which a lot of people do. We can meet up and have that exchange of community that way. I guess really I'm just asking, is there any free advice that I could take away from your experience of building these organizations and cultivating communities that I should try?
I think you're doing it. That's like what's cool. Like we in San Diego, we don't have a lot of that yet because again, there's like, even though there's a lot of diversity, it always still feels like there's one way to be and there's one way to find happiness and joy in San Diego. So everybody has to put themselves aside and go like, I guess I have to enjoy the beach. I guess I have to enjoy these things because a lot of those other things aren't accessible, right? So a lot of the art spaces aren't accessible. They aren't free during a particular time of the year. Whereas in other cities, that stuff exists. And then it encourages people to go like, hey, I'm into Magic the Gathering. There are definitely other people into Magic the Gathering because I live in a space that showcases diversity and showcases that you can be anything you want to be. So then you feel more inclined to even create something like that. I feel like people here would be like worried to create something like that because they'd be like, who else is even into Magic the Gathering? I got to leave this city in order to find that.
Yeah.
Like that to me is the beauty of a city that has institutional investment in diversity. Whereas cities that don't have institutional investment in diversity and have institutional investment in creating like a homogenous, beautiful picture, it makes everybody else feel that doesn't fit into that box. Like I can't belong here. Like one kid, he was like, I grew up here. I'm a music producer, but I've always felt like the stepchild that the city doesn't care about. So they just felt like they needed to leave San Diego. Whereas again, if they grew up in somewhere else, like in New York or wherever, you might still feel that, but it's not to the extent of it is here in San Diego. Yeah, so that's something I feel like you guys are already doing it. The fact that there's like two different communities that are vastly different and diverse, but then there probably can still be this like beautiful overlap between them. That's what's special about what you guys are doing.
Gonna just keep pushing it forward. I think even expanding that at some point in the future with this podcast as it continues to grow. Maybe it's just like Discord groups or other community groups within it, and maybe even bringing on people that have been guests on the show to kind of give like personal talks or like help out at certain points. But thinking through all of those logistics for the future as this continues to grow.
Well, yeah, you should create a festival.
I want to. I've thought about this for years. I'm like, I got to get in touch with the music people and really get something going because that would be amazing.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Like I think if like people in the world of design did that, where it was like a variation of Coachella, maybe not obviously as big, but it had all these different sort of like cultural aspects, and it was about coming together to experience culture. But then you also have talks. Obviously, you have South by Southwest, but I feel like that's also gotten like taken over just by like brands wanting to showcase brands and just showcase the cool new things that they're doing, as opposed to just like creatives coming together just to be like hyper creative.
Yeah, no, it's true. I feel like in essence, designers are so creative, but tend to fit themselves into a mold and go down that avenue, but don't realize that they can use design creativity to create literally anything that they want.
Yeah. And again, I feel like that should also be the other takeaway from all my random stuff. Like at Basic, we learned to create anything we wanted through the use of design and through the use of branding, recognizing that you're doing it for every other company, for these multi-billion-dollar brands, which are great and we still should do, great portfolio and all that stuff. And it's great learning, but being able to apply that to your own ideas when you have an idea is like the real gem and sweet spot of like all of the things we're learning at the agencies, in the agency space, right? Like the idea to just say like, hey, I see this tension within this neighborhood in this city of businesses shutting down, lack of foot traffic. There's no space for free accessible space for art. There's divided and dispersed communities, even though there's a bunch of cool people here. And then going like, how do you respond to that? We create a jazz night. With the jazz night, then you get to create all the posters, all of the merchandise. You get to create the signage, create the whole brand and aesthetic around it. So it's like if people ever wanted to do branding for an event or for a band, it's like just create the thing where the band gets created within the thing, and then you get to brand everything. That's almost like how I look at things now, where I'm like, did I ever I wanted to do campaigns for fashion brands and do designs for retail spaces. I'm like, oh, now I have FUTURE is Color, so I can actually design my retail space and like work with architects and work with like interior designers to actually structure and shape it based on my inspiration. And then I can create all the campaigns that go with it. I can do all of the video stuff that goes with it. I can find the models and tell the story that I want to tell. So yeah, it's like with design, we have the ability to really create any dream we've ever had.
So true and so beautiful. And one book that I think you would like, super easy read, by Derek Sivers. It's called Anything You Want. And it's 40 lessons from his entrepreneurial journey of accidentally starting CD Baby. And I think it's like kind of a perfect book for this message of just like falling into something, really putting in the love and the hustle. And then he ended up selling it, but he found a new identity through the selling of the company and starting new journeys. And it is like a book about, you can do anything you want. Just think about it and put your heart into it and make it happen.
Yeah, exactly. And I also, there's like that true, for me, again, there's that thing of, if you're not starting it because you're like, I just want to capitalize and make money, and it truly is, I see this thing, I really want to do it, I'm passionate about it, then there is almost no failing at it. Because the goal, even for Studio System, the goal was never to make money. So if it never makes money, we're still good. As long as people come together, gather, enjoy their time with one another, make new connections, then that's sort of like the metric for success for a lot of the things that I do.
One thing that I've really had to learn, and I think it's kind of the East Coast hustle mindset in a way, where I've had to learn, is defining my own metrics for success, not the world's metrics for success. So starting the podcast, I launched like the first week, and I'm like, my goal was 300 subscribers per episode. But the thing is, like, that didn't happen, and that's okay. And it's because my expectations versus reality were not aligned. And I was using, I don't know, these made up numbers out of bullshit nowhere to try and bring happiness, when the true happiness is making the thing and having the conversation. Everything else that happens is just extra.
Yeah. I posted something about that where it's like true joy is found when you have deep knowledge of self, and deep knowledge of self is also understanding the things that actually bring you joy, as opposed to the things outside of ourselves that are told to bring us joy. And so even the Eric Fromm book was like, for me, a huge sort of lesson in that, because it talks about how we typically shape ourselves and our personas based on these external motivations, which have nothing to do with who we really are. So in a way, we essentially are constantly lying to ourselves in order to show up to other people the way we feel like we should show up to them. But in that way, you're actually lying to them too. So it's more so, how do we understand ourselves in such a way that we can just follow and chase our own pursuit of joy, which might not make sense to other people, but that's okay. And it's how do we just create a world where we can exist like that? Because I feel like I fall into that. That's maybe just like the ongoing journey of entrepreneurship. Because I fall into that all of the time with Future is Color. And I'm like, oh no, what if this collection doesn't do well, or blah, blah, blah. Or I like see somebody else with the collaboration. I'm like, dang, that's really cool. How come I don't have that? And then like in the moment, it's being hyper present with oneself to understand that those are going to happen. You're going to have those thoughts, but making sure that you sort of like check in with yourself to see like, do you actually want that collaboration? Do I actually want to work with that brand? Or is it just because someone else is? That inner child in me is starting to be like, I want that too. He has that toy and I want it. And so, I feel like that's just something we will always face. But even for me, this season of life has been understanding the healing journey, understanding how to be hyper present with my own emotions, my own feelings, and knowledge of those feelings and where they're coming from, where triggers are coming from. So I know how to respond in most situations. And I try and just like stay grounded in most situations. So I don't like start chasing other people's dreams and other people's desires, because anywhere where these things started, like Future is Color didn't start from me chasing someone else's idea of what success is with clothing. I didn't even want to start a clothing brand. So I had no ability to chase someone else's idea of success with it. So it was more like I just started because I had something to say. So as long as I stay true to that, and that's what I was saying, even for like younger people, as long as you stay true to the thing that you have to say, then you are able to develop as a person. And if we look at all projects as a pathway for ongoing development of ourselves, then again, it's not about the outward success, but it's about in our listening room experience, we just had the last topic was self-actualization. And self-actualization is really focused on how are you developing in your sense of self, not according to any sort of like outward success metric, right? And so when we look at projects and everything we put out and every artifact we create as an opportunity to self-actualize, then to me it becomes like a more powerful journey of life, and a journey that's filled with a little bit more joy and less like more joy.
That's what we all need in our lives. A little less stress and a little more joy.
Oh yeah.
I want to be sensitive to your time since we're already over the allotted time that we had in theory. But when is the next Future is Color collaboration coming out?
Yeah, so the next collection is releasing most likely in February, like the top of February. It's going to be releasing in FootLocker. And so if you were to go on my Instagram or like the Future is Color Instagram, or go to the website, there'll be like direct links to that collection. And that collection is focused on reclaiming one's personhood by claiming the ability and power to dream. And so I think this whole sort of conversation has almost been in that vein of like understanding the power of a dream. And it's not like when you're sleeping, you're dreaming, but it's like the ability to take ownership over one's life and carve out one's future based on your own ideas. And when you actually have the freedom to dream, you're able to shape a world that's based on your own experiences and ideas. So it gives you autonomy over your own life. So that's like the premise of the collection. And it's really focused on like redefining the American dream as we go into this next year, especially with everything happening just in general around the world. How do we redefine that dream to include all of us? Yeah.
Super important. Well, I can't wait to see that drop, and I can't wait to pick some up probably online and support you in everything that you're doing. Are there any additional ways that we can support you in Open Gym and Future is Color?
Follow along with Future is Color and studio sessions. I would say that's like the main way. And if you're ever in San Diego, come check out one of our restaurants.
Do you have a specific list of restaurants?
So the restaurants are White Rice, which is Filipino rice bowls.
Oh, yum.
We have a new one that's going to be opening probably in like 3 months. Construction is always like a headache, but that's called Wildflower. So that's going to be like a New York style deli with a like cocktail lounge as well, and we're planning like programming and live music in that space.
Amazing. That sounds incredible. Well, I can't wait to come out there because I'll hit you up and we'll have to go around the city.
Oh yeah, please. And I always tell that to people, like, if anybody is ever in San Diego, feel free to DM me, and I always try and respond.
Make sure to check out the show notes in the description of the episode for all the links to the books, the social media, and the restaurants. It'll all be down there in the episode description. And then make sure, if you're in California or in San Diego specifically, to hit up one of the live studio sessions and check out Future is Color at the retail store. And remember that we're all legendary and have an amazing story of our own. So on the journey, take the time to be kind, grind, and unwind. Treat your fellow humans with respect and empathy. Design has more power than you know. Use it to create spaces of love. So let's make the world a better and more creative place to live. Erwin, thank you so much for being here. This has been incredible and I really appreciate it.
No, thank you.